I've called today's video Synoptic Variations Don't Make It Too Complicated. And the stories I'm going to be talking about today from the Gospels are the healing of the woman with the issue of blood and the raising of Jairus' daughter. These stories are found together in all three of the Gospels known as synoptics. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'm going to be talking about a paper that deals with the synoptic variations in those stories. And because I'm talking about a paper, it'll be a slightly longer video. I want to talk a little bit about what's known as the theory of Markan priority. And I want to do this because one of the things I think I can bring to New Testament scholarship is a fresh perspective on what it means to talk about Markan priority. You'll hear scholars say, okay, the synoptic problem and the answer to that is Markan priority. And that's the idea in a very minimal sense that Mark's gospel was written first and that Matthew and Luke made use of it as a source. Now, when it's stated like that, it sounds just like a sort of dusty scholarly theory. Who could possibly object to it? Maybe that's true, and maybe it is true. The problem is that scholars will sometimes say, well, most scholars today accept Markan priority, but then they load it with extra baggage without realizing that that extra baggage doesn't follow from the more minimal version. And the extra baggage goes approximately like this. When a story is found both in Mark's gospel and in Matthew and or Luke, and it's got similar wording and so forth, especially when it has similar wording, then Matthew and or Luke, whoever else has it, got any factual material that they have only from Mark. They don't have any other access to the facts. Now, I know that the term erasure is a jargon term right now, but what this version of Markan priority amounts to is the erasure of Matthew and Luke as separate witnesses or having separate witnesses whenever a story that they tell is also found in Mark. And that's kind of interesting because we know that Luke did have other human sources. At least it certainly looks like it. And Matthew was himself a disciple. So both of them could have gotten additional information, and they could have added it even to stories where they were using Mark. You know, you use Mark to copy. There's no concern about plagiarism at that time. Might as well use that as a sort of a starter, but then you could insert other bits of information into that story. And there's no reason that Matthew and Luke could not have done that, even if they're using Mark. But what you'll see again and again is a form of redaction criticism, as it's called, where every variation is taken to be something that they added without additional factual information. So if it is additional, they must have made it up or guessed it or just conjectured it or something. They didn't actually have separate access to the facts because they're just using Mark. That doesn't follow even if Mark was written first and even if they are using Mark. So if you hear a scholar say, well, most scholars accept Markan priority, you should say, well, if what you mean is most scholars accept this heavier view that erases Matthew and Luke wherever they appear similar to Mark, then I'm going to challenge that, even if that is a scholarly consensus, because it doesn't follow from the more minimal thing that Mark wrote first and that he was a source for them. That distinction is so important, and it's something that I don't hear enough other people making. In the paper I'm going to discuss today, one of his suggestions is that Luke added the term only daughter, that the girl was Jairus' only daughter, apparently without any factual justification. He just added that. And the author said this was added for clarity. Well, making something up doesn't really help clarity if you don't have any reason to think it's true. Okay, but this is just supposed to be Luke's redaction of Mark. And so we need to be watching for that. And that's an example of that erasing, that Luke couldn't have talked to someone else who happened to mention that she was his only daughter, even though many of Luke's changes, if we think of them even as changes to Mark, if we even think of Mark as his source, they appear to be, as we'll discuss, just very casual variations, telling it in his own words or cutting something out, that kind of thing that doesn't require additional information. The only daughter is additional information. So why couldn't he have gotten that from another source? That's the kind of thing that I want to draw attention to. The paper I'm going to discuss today, and you'll excuse my using notes, is by a scholar that I had never heard of before. I've never read anything else by him. So I'm just talking about this paper. His name is Thomas Lyons. He's a fairly recent graduate with his PhD from Asbury Seminary. It is called The Rhetoric of Redaction, a Rhetorical Analysis of Redaction in Luke. I'll put a link to it on academia.edu in the show notes, and it looks like it's forthcoming in an anthology. So this scholar's name is Lyons, and I want to highlight the way that Dr. Lyons apparently has been taught. Not only is he functionally, though without stating it, using that stronger version of the two-source hypothesis that I just described, but he's also regarding every tiny difference between Luke's and Mark's wording of the story as being a result of a highly deliberate choice by Luke. And we find this same way of looking at synoptic differences in many other scholars, both liberal and conservative, both evangelical and non-evangelical. The authors are assumed to make the smallest verbal changes as if they're staring at Mark and they're saying, oh, I think I'll cut that word, or I'll cut that little story element, and so forth, with some thematic purpose or reason or symbolism in mind. Nothing is treated as casual. And you could have casual variation either between different witnesses who tell the same story, or if Luke or Matthew read the story and Mark took notes and then closed that big scroll, because it's very hard to juggle two scrolls without a writing table, which they wouldn't have had, and opened up their own scroll on which they were writing and wrote their gospel from partly memory of what they've just read and partly notes on papyrus. So then you can just get them telling things in their own words, or just casually cutting things or varying wording without it meaning anything heavy, and without like peering at that bit in Mark with both of them open and saying, oh, I've got a reason why I'm going to change that in just this way. So that is making it too complicated, as my title says. Now, Dr. Lyons is also trying to use what are called the progymnosmeter of Theon, which were these writing exercises. I'm going to link in the show notes some other work that I've done, and I also discussed this extensively in The Mirror or the Mask. It's being said by a lot of scholars. Dr. Michael Licona is someone who's popularized this. There were liberal scholars named Mack and Robbins, who were some of the earliest to popularize this, that these progymnosmata taught the students that it was legitimate to be somewhat loose and change facts in history. And I've argued elsewhere that that's not even what these exercises are about. Luke has some of the highest Greek in the New Testament, though it is possible, and he was probably a Gentile. So just on broad general background considerations, it isn't all that implausible that he may have studied something like the progymnosmata, even though that particular book might not have been written at that time. But those kinds of they were schoolboy exercises. It wouldn't have been in the highest level of rhetorical education. Stanley Porter has argued, maybe around 12 or 13 or even younger. And so maybe he did, but that's just on general background considerations. And there's really nothing in Dr. Lyons' article that gives us additional reason to believe that he was influenced by them, nor that they taught factual change. And the comparisons that he makes are weak, and they, in my opinion, and they don't really provide that additional information. Now, one way in which the comparison does not give additional reason to think that Luke was somehow using or following the progymnosmata is that Lyons uses very broad categories like clarity and conciseness. Any good writer is going to try to be clear and concise, and that really doesn't tell us what curriculum he was taught from. And yes, Theon does urge clarity and conciseness, but even if we would praise Luke for his clarity and conciseness, which are not always in evidence, but even if we do, that really doesn't tell us anything very specific at all about what exercises he was taught from. We'll see later that he's actually unclear at one point in the story, and he actually adds things sometimes, so he's not always more concise than Mark either. Moreover, the redactions that Dr. Lyons alleges aren't really well fitted into clarity. So the example I just gave of adding only daughter, he attributes to clarity. And as I pointed out, making something up isn't just making it more clear and adding it without factual justification. He also says, now this one isn't, making something up, but Luke describes the girl's resurrection by saying her spirit returned. And Lyon says this promotes clarity because it makes it clear that she was dead. But in all of the Synoptic Gospels, they're clearly narrating that, they believe she was dead. For example, in Mark, which Luke is allegedly using, and in Luke as well, there are messengers that come from Jairus's house and say, "Don't trouble the master anymore. She's died." So there's no ambiguity on this in Mark, and it doesn't really fit with a category of adding clarity. That's just the way Luke chose to describe her coming to life again. So that's an artificial attempt to connect it with something that Theon says, and it doesn't really add extra evidence. He's also very interested in parallelism. We've talked before about something like parallelomania, as it's sometimes called, or trying to say that there are symbolic or Old Testament allusions in the Gospels where there's not really good reason. And so Theon does talk about parallels and comparison and contrasting and so forth, but Lyons is trying too hard to bring this in. So, for example, he says that Luke's use of the phrase, her spirit returned, is meant to parallel Jesus to Elijah in 1 Kings 17. Elijah raises a boy from the dead, and it says that his nephesh, which would be spirit or breath, very similar meaning, came back or returned. And here it's the word in Greek is pneuma, which also can mean life, spirit, or breath. But there's no reason to think that that's an attempt to compare Jesus to Elijah. In fact, John the Baptist is usually compared to Elijah. So, we're always looking for somebody else to compare Jesus to, Maybe he's Elijah. Maybe he's Elisha. Maybe he's Moses. Maybe, maybe, etc. And that's just, again, as I've discussed in other videos, really showing the ingenuity of the interpreter. That notion of the life being in the breath is a very Jewish notion, but it also could be thought of as a medical notion. If Luke is a doctor, that you would check for the breathing if the person was alive again. So we don't even know whether this should be translated as her breath returned or her life returned or her spirit returned. So it's just artificial and a kind of overreading to say that this is an attempt to parallel Jesus to Elijah. But there's more, and this is kind of interesting. This factual change gets kind of eyebrow raising in Dr. Lyons' article, even beyond adding only daughter without factual justification. There's a place where Dr. Lyons is forced to acknowledge that it looks like Luke is less clear than Mark. This is because Luke omits any mention of the mourners. Now, both Matthew and Mark say that when they came to the house where the girl was, there were mourners. Matthew mentions flute players, which is kind of interesting. Flute players might be part of mourning. And Jesus, of course, as you may remember in the story, if you know the story, says she is not dead, but she is sleeping. And that was a way that Jesus had of referring to sleep. He says that Lazarus is sleeping, that they go to waken him. And the disciples are confused. But here where he says she's not dead but sleeping, it says that they were laughing at him. Now, since Matthew and Mark mentioned the mourners or the flute players, it's I would say pretty clear that it was they who were laughing at Jesus. They don't know Jesus well. They aren't the ones who went to ask for Jesus' help and so forth. And so, they're just like, ha, this guy's, what do you mean she's sleeping? We know she's dead. But because Luke is at this point shortening, he omits the mention of the mourners. There's some ambiguity because the only people he's mentioned in the immediate vicinity are Peter, James, and John, and the girl's father and mother, who are the only ones that Jesus allows to go in with him to the room. And it could appear that he's saying they were laughing at Jesus. Now, that would be very improbable. We have no other incident when the disciples laugh at Jesus. The disciples, Peter even will sometimes argue with Jesus. He even, it says at one point, rebukes Jesus. Lord, may it never be, you won't die, and so forth, but never laughter. And Jairus has shown great respect to Jesus by coming and asking for his help. Very improbable that they would have laughed at Jesus. And it's, I think, very problematic to imagine Lucas deliberately changing the story to make them be the ones laughing at Jesus. But that is what Dr. Lyons suggests, rather than attribute unclarity to Luke, which is what I think happened. I think he was just naturally varying the story, telling it in his own words, left that out, and did not realize that that would make it a little bit unclear as to who was laughing at Jesus. So it's just a slip. I mean, that kind of thing can happen quite easily, especially if you're shortening. It doesn't occur to you that that might create a misunderstanding. But Lyons doesn't want to attribute unclarity to Luke because he wants Luke to be very deliberately redacting. That's how he's thinking of it, as having Mark open, and all his redactions are very deliberate. So he says, no, look at the context. It looks like they're the ones who are laughing. So then his idea is this. Just as Theon says to do a compare and contrast, which was called a synkrisis. So he's saying Luke is doing a synkrisis here, and he's comparing and contrasting the faith of the woman with the issue of blood, who said if she could only touch Jesus' garment, she would be healed, with the lack of faith of Jairus and the disciples who've just witnessed evidence of this other miracle with the woman, which Jesus performed as he was coming. And yet, nonetheless, here when Jesus says she's not dead but sleeping, they laugh at him. So that this is an attempt to contrast her faith with their lack of faith. I think that's very, very problematic. I mean, you're basically slandering people by making them laugh at Jesus when you know that that's not what your source says. And when he's implying that Luke didn't have any other source for the story, and she's going to change that story. But everything has to be heavy and deliberate. Now, there's also other ways in which you'll see that the wording can't just vary. So, for example, when Jesus turns to Jairus, the messengers have come, and he says, don't be afraid, only believe. And he says that in all the accounts. But in Luke, he says, and she will be made well. So that, few extra words are in Luke, and they're unique to Luke, and she will be made well. And Lyons says that that's added to make more of a parallel to what Jesus said to the woman. If you've believed and it's healed you, your faith has healed you, only believe and she will be made well. But that's just a natural variation. That's just Luke telling the story in his own way. So it's making it too complicated to say that he's not that it's changing the facts, but it's just unnecessary. It's the same, you're peering at Mark. I think I'll add, and she will be made well, in order to make it parallel to what Jesus said up here, instead of just, that is what Jesus meant. Only believe and, what? I mean, that's what it means. Only believe and she will be made well. But nothing can ever be just a natural variation. And that's what we need to get back to. Now, Dr. Lyons also briefly discusses Matthew's different way of telling the story. That's not the main topic of his article. You may have heard, and I've discussed elsewhere, something that a lot of evangelical authors will talk about, which is this difference at the beginning between Matthew and Mark. And in Matthew, it says that Jairus said that his daughter had just died. And in Mark, it says that Jairus said that, that his daughter was going to die, and Luke as well. And so, who changed it, and did they change it, and did Matthew have another source, and so forth. That's more common. And of course, Lyons accepts that Matthew made it different, but I'm even more interested in this video, and I've discussed that elsewhere. I think that that's evidence for Matthew having another factual source. But Lyons says that there are even more differences, and he means like contradictory differences. It's very clear that that's what he means, that Matthew has made changes to the story, and it's really, I think, perturbing to see how he's artificially creating contradictions out of mere omission of material. This is the kind of thing you would more expect to see, or I would previously have more expected to see in a more liberal scholar, but I actually believe it's becoming more common, maybe even very common, among scholars trained at conservative seminaries. But imagine if you had heard someone, a skeptical scholar like Bart Ehrman or something, say that these are contradictions between Matthew and Mark. What would you say? So let me give these examples, and I think we would answer them if they were coming from a different source. So I think we need to answer them whatever source they're coming from. So Matthew just leaves out the part where Jesus asks who touched him. So this is in the part where the woman interrupts his journey to Jairus's house. And in Mark, it's, she comes and touches him because she thinks, if I can only touch him, I'll be healed. And then when she touches him, she can feel that she's been healed. And Jesus says, who touched me? And his disciples say, oh, the crowd is crowding around you. What do you mean, who touched you? And Jesus said, no, I could feel that some virtue or strength went out of me. And then he turns around and the woman comes forward, then trembling, and tells them the whole story. Well, Matthew just eliminates the material there. And he leaves out her coming forward, for example. He says that, when Jesus turned and saw her, and he said that her faith has healed her. So Lyons says that in Matthew, the woman does not come forward voluntarily. And Jesus only turns around and sees her. So you see how a mere omission of material has been turned into an actual change in the facts of the story, as if Matthew was asserting that the things in Mark did not happen. But that's an overreading. Or, for example, Matthew tells what Jesus says to her, and then he says that she was cured from that very hour. That's like the literal meaning of the Greek, from that hour. She was cured. Lyons says this means that in Mark, she's cured a minute or two earlier when she touches Jesus' garment. But in Matthew, he's actually non-factually moved it that she's not cured until after Jesus speaks to her. I mean, it's only a few minutes change, but it's like the fact that Matthew says first what Jesus said and then says she was cured from that very hour. Lyons overreads to mean that Matthew's actually moved the time of her cure. That's, again, creating a contradiction between Matthew and Mark, because you have to have a contradiction to have a change. Let me just add, some people will say that these fact changes are answering alleged contradictions. No, they're agreeing with contradictions. And then they're just saying that's okay because it was allowed by the standards of the time or something like that. But that is affirming that there's a contradiction. Okay. And he's affirming that Matthew's changed it. Another one is that he says that in Matthew, there are no exclusive observers of the cure or the raising of Jairus' daughter. No exclusive observers in Matthew. Now, Matthew doesn't list the exclusive observers, but he does say that Jesus put the crowd out and then raised her. It's a very reasonable assumption that there were other people there who then went and told the story, because it immediately says the story went out everywhere. But he just doesn't list, as in the other Gospels, Peter, James, John, the girl's mother and father. So then Lyons says there aren't any exclusive observers. Again, this is creating a contradiction between Matthew's and Mark's Gospel, and an actual change to the story in Matthew that is not there. Now, because he's not focusing on Matthew, he doesn't tell us what he thinks Matthew's reasons were for these factual changes in the story, or his motives. But of course, once you say the author's made a deliberate change to the facts, then you have to conjecture a motive, and presumably has something in mind. But that's not a good way to approach the text, is you're actually making contradictions where they aren't there. So I've gone over parts of this academic article in detail because I'm trying to show what's being taught even in our more conservative seminaries, and I'm trying to issue a kind of concern and warning about several things in Gospels criticism and scholarship that I think can be done better. First of all, the tendency to try to make minor variations mean something more than the evidence will bear is unfortunately pretty common, and it's not good. It's unjustified, and it makes problems where problems don't exist, and it goes beyond the evidence, way beyond the evidence. Second, there's a tendency to think that if you could put a label onto something, you have increased understanding of the passage. So calling something, you know, syncresis, for example, or relating it to some virtue that Theon advocates. But that doesn't actually add understanding of the passage automatically. Third, we desperately need to bring back more ordinary, boring categories to our understanding of synoptic variation. Not this kind of heavy redaction, but just allow the authors to tell the stories in their own words, and to just drop things because they're trying to shorten it at that point, but not trying to change it. Um, just say it in their own words, or say her spirit returned, or whatever, but not because you're trying to make some heavy point. That really is too artificial, and it leads us astray, I believe, because there's this idea that there had to be a heavy reason, and then we just have to figure out what it was. That gives us an illusion. And finally, that the fact that a scholar can write an article like that, and that it's published, and even if many articles like that are published, doesn't actually mean that it's correct. It could still be completely incorrect and going completely in the wrong direction. And so there's an illusion that once scholars have done this, then you have to say, oh, wow, maybe this is true, because I wouldn't want to go up against scholars. And scholars themselves, I think this way. I've written this article, or so-and-so has written this article. So now we have more evidence that Luke used Theon, or something like that. Or we have more evidence that Theon taught them to change facts, or whatever, because it's in the literature. But the literature can be wrong. Even very wrong. So I am not doing this to pick on anybody. I want to emphasize again, when I do these analyses, when I criticize a scholar, it's all about the arguments. This is not in any way personal. This is scholar to scholar. Just here's a view. Here's why I disagree with it, and that's how we roll here at the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.